In our modern world, the average person has access to such a massive wealth of information by the use of various advanced technological tools. This new age information overload has made it so even new generations in all different walks of life are exposed to creations, ideas, and traumas that only previous generations and certain groups were privy to. For example, your average 13-year-old kid could be exposed to obscure fan mecha anime from the 80s, obscure horror anime, to a list of the most disturbing movies ever made that back in the day only the most dedicated fans would know about and share this information amongst themselves. With all these obscure things becoming more and more exposed, and with people getting more hungrier for obscure knowledge and creations, I think it is just as important to have information available to help understand, demystify, and contextualize much of this information. Many pieces of art come from a community of outcasts and oppressed people, and many take to creating more extreme narratives and transgressive art to express themselves and to explain issues in society. Someone coming from a different background may not understand anything from this community that a work can come from, and they may not fully understand or even misinterpret something for what it is not. Then, they will spread this false information on social media to others who also do not understand the context and history behind a work and will continue to spread this false information. Today, that's exactly the goal I have in mind, is to alleviate this issue. Lately, I even see more and more discussion centered around the artist Zero Comma and their legendary post-industrial dark ambient masterpiece, The Secret Eye of Lila. There was also a really lovely reissue of the entire Necrophile catalog, reissued in a box set by Vinyl On Demand, so even more people are being exposed to all this work. Even when this work was first released, there was much mystery and speculation as well as conspiracy surrounding this album, and I believe that cycle could be repeated yet again without the understanding of the artists and their purpose behind it. Like my video on Marco and his 8-track Smart project, I want to give understanding to the human behind the music and their purpose for creating it. Today, I will try to explain the story of the Ritual Dark Ambient album that was made using real human bones. In 1984, a strange little tape appeared within the triptide scene called The Secret Eye of Lila by an artist called Zero Comma. Inside of this tape was some of the most intense, beautiful, atmospheric, and mysterious post-industrial and dark ambient that had been heard up until this point. This was a strangely enigmatic tape, the odd title, the weird symbols printed on the J card, the fact that it came from a strange label called Necrophile Records. Even more odd was the rhythmic sounds within these tracks. They had the sound of a more indigenous sounding instruments and were reminiscent of some of the Psychic TV Tibetan human thigh bone recordings. In fact, it was said that the music within this album was made entirely out of instruments made of human bones. The unintentional secretive life of the artist Zero Comma only helped add to the mystique of this mysterious work. And at the end of it all, it turned out that these rumors were in fact very true. Zero Comma, whose real name is Zoe DeWitt, had in fact gathered human remains and transformed them into playable instruments and recorded an album that would transform the post-industrial landscape forever. We had a new genre appearing that was focused on rhythmic sound and traditional instruments being incorporated into the dark and ethereal ambient sounds, places that take you into the deepest caverns and the darkest woods, but offer you a new insight into the different aspects of human nature. I want to say right now that there was no super duper evil satanic pits of hell thinking whatsoever with this album. So if you're thinking is much the equivalent of this post right here on Rate Your Music, then that right here is one of the main things I want to dispel with this video. So there are a few topics that are important to understand to fully appreciate and understand Zoe and her work. Firstly, let's learn a little bit about the human that is known as Zoe DeWitt. Secondly, it is important to understand the context of the post-industrial scene, its creation, its goals, the topics, and how it had helped create Zoe's own vision for the genre. Lastly, the work of English artist and occultist Osman Sparr. His art and writings, as well as his approach to magic, were heavy influences on Zoe. Understanding all this will really help to fully understand the intention Zoe had of creating these boned instruments and creating such a personal and esoteric album with their sound. So let us begin our deep dive and learn about the world that helped birth the start of the ritual ambient genre. So let's start at the beginning. Zoe DeWitt, born Michael Spirlhofer, was born in Vienna, Austria, where her father was studying sculpture at the Academy of Fine Arts. After living in Vienna for the first 8 years of her life, she spent her youth growing up in a small town in the Austrian Alps. Zoe had a friend introduce her to experimental music of the 1970s, as well as becoming interested in the writing of the English artist Osman Sparr. Through these things, she found much interest in the industrial music scene, as well as topics of mental health and ritual. Zoe had also been reading the works of performance artist Antoine Artaud, such as the book The Theater and Its Double, and learned about the theater of cruelty. The concept of the theater of cruelty is actually a very integral part of early industrial music, as the original group, Throbbing Gristle, had also come from a performance artist group known as Coombe Transmissions. The theater of cruelty was the concept of performance art taken to its most extreme. Artaud had no interest in realism within theater and wanted to make it return to its surrealist roots in myth, magic, and ritual. Artaud was born in France and was sickly as a child, having contracted meningitis. Because of his illness, he struggled with mental health issues in his early teens and was given opium to help treat his symptoms, as well as many forced sanitarium stays. These treatments did not help, and Artaud became afflicted with a lifelong addiction to opium. He had also been forced into many inhumane mental health treatments, such as electroshock therapy, which causes small currents of electricity to flow through the brain to trigger seizures in an attempt to help the brain's chemistry. The struggles in his own life and mental health helped him to create these plays that would help to show people who did not suffer the perspective of those who do. He believed the reality of life could only be captured in art through violence and ritualistic and extreme elements of expression. Hallucination and fear were essential and were meant to hypnotize the viewer and help them open up to the feelings that were trying to be conveyed. He believed that society had forgotten the darker aspects of humanity, and the theater was going to help them realize the darker reality of real life and how violent it could be. This exact sentiment can be echoed within the early works of the industrial genre as well as the post-industrial genre. Many of these early artists had the same issues as society, trying to ignore the awful realities that many people had suffered with, and wanted to take those issues and shove them back into the face of the ones trying to ignore them. Many early industrial musicians came from poor working class families or had mental health issues or were struggling with sexual identities, problems that were actively trying to be swept under the rug, especially in a post-World War II era. Many of these artists knew the concepts of the theater of cruelty and wanted to take the same actions with their music and art. Zoe understood all this very well and would use the idea of the theater of cruelty as guiding principles in her own work. When Zoe was 19, she wrote a book that was mainly influenced by Artaud in industrial music titled Mein Herz ist blind, or Mein Heart is Blind. I believe this book also contained a razor blade taped to the back of it, an understanding between the author and the reader. She wrote this under the pen name Michael Q, and the publisher of this book, Peter Heese, helped to introduce Zoe to the mail art exchange of the industrial underground. This would help her get into contact with artists such as Genesis Peorage of Throbbing Gristle and Graham Reval of SPK. This would later lead her to entering the Temple of Psychic Youth and a friendship with John Bounce of Coil, but more on that in a bit. In the 1980s, she returned to Vienna to study electroacoustic music at the University of Music and Performing Arts. This is where she learned many valuable techniques, and mainly how to create tape loops. These tape loops helped her with the creation of her first music project, Korpses Katatonik. This was a more raw, early industrial-style album that was very much inspired by projects like SPK and Nocturnal Emissions. In Zoe's own words, the project's main themes were dark, psychiatry, pathological abnormalism, necrophilia, and other types of paraphilic aberration. This album was the first release on Zoe's new Necrophile Records, and the full title of the album is actually, excuse my German or trying to pronounce this album, but I wanted to give it a shot, subclinical leucotomy, aphrenia, zasophilic, lysophobo, asphyxia, sinister, lethal, anorex. This album title and themes are definitely heavily influenced by the Project SBK and their love of odd, dark, and medical-related abbreviations in their titles. For a first-time project, the level of skill and understanding of the genre is really amazing. The whole tape does indeed feel like a precursor to Zoe's eventual work on Zero Comma, with its dark, slow, rhythmic sound and almost cavernous atmosphere that is dark and disturbing. There are already samples of bones crunching and cracking and moans that almost sound like a ritual being performed in the background. Just a really great piece of music that can be seen as a precursor to what would eventually become the ritual industrial or ritual ambient genre. So now that we have reached the 80s and have discussed Zoe's artistic endeavors so far, let's take time to discuss the musical landscape at the time that she was involved in. The beginnings of what many describe to be the post-industrial scene. This is an important topic to discuss for Zoe as well, as even in her own book and lectures, she has created an entire outline in graph form for trying to understand all the influences and musical changes that helped the shift from first wave industrial, that is groups like Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire, into the post-industrial, such as SBK, Psychic TV, Zero Comma, etc. Early musings of this shift can be seen within the second release on Necrophilia Records with the album What's History? By Stan Bingo and Genesis Peorage. According to Zoe, she had asked Jen to release this previous unreleased project on her label, and states that music here was very much a preview of the music that would be heard in Genesis' project after Throbbing Gristle, Psychic TV. This recording was, funny enough, made before Throbbing Gristle was disbanded in 1981, proving that he was already thinking about working on this new musical shift. After Throbbing Gristle disbanded due to personal issues amongst its members, the four musicians would take their own paths and eventually create their own groups. Chris Carter and Cozy Fanny Tootie would go on to create the fantastic electro synth-pop group Chris and Cozy. Peter Sleazy Christopherson would go on to create the absolutely incredible and influential group Coil with his partner John Balance. But first, he would follow Genesis into his new project, Psychic TV. Psychic TV was the propaganda arm of Genesis' parody cult, The Temple of Psychic Youth. This particular group, Psychic TV, was the shift industrial would see from the subversion of using technology and information in offensive electronic sounds to more magic, psychedelic, acoustic, occult themes. Given the fact that industrial has always flirted with the topics, such as Aleister Crowley and interest in various rituals from other cultures, this shift in topics and sound did not seem like it was coming out of left field, but more so an organic evolution in the genre sound. We went from this to this. It is also interesting to note that during this time, many other industrial musicians like David Tibet of Kurt 93 were struggling artists, and many lived together in communes. These communes in the 70s and 80s tended to enjoy learning and practicing occult ideas and exploring magic rituals, so many of these musicians were already exposed to these unique ideas if they weren't already interested. Many of these outsider and transgressive artists would also go on to join Jen's The Temple of Psychic Youth, also known as Topi, including filmmaker Derek Jarman, Soft Cell's Mark Almond, and of course, Zoe DeWitt. Topi is deserving of its own rabbit hole deep dive video essay itself because it's just so massive and involved, but the main premise was supposed to be in its own way a kind of parody of the many cults that had been propped up during those times, such as the Process Church and the Satanist Church. The focus of the temple was to utilize sex magic in the way Osman Sparr had dictated, and to create transgressive art to make an impact on outside society. The group had even created texts for the teachings, such as the Psychic Bible. However, despite trying to mock many cults and their tactics, the Temple of Psychic Youth would fall to its own trappings and succumb to power trips and ego issues. Now, back onto the early days of the music group Psychic TV. This group, while mainly being led by Genesis Peorage, had a revolving collective of fellow artists who engaged with different albums over the span of the group's discography. It was during this time that Jeffrey Rushton, also known as John Balance, joined the group along with David Tibet. In 1984, at the age of 21, Zoe joined Topi and had begun corresponding with John as he was the one answering her letters in the organization. Despite not having ever met John in person, they had a friendship built upon shared interests and intellectual pursuits, and Zoe felt she had learned a bit about John as a person, and his early ideas that would eventually come to fruition in his musical project, Coil. In fact, the first ever appearance of Coil would be on Necrophile Records, with their first track appearing on the Beast 666 compilation, the third tape to release on Necrophile. These tracks were called Here to Hear, Double-Headed Secret. They would go on to release their first collection of songs before any Coil album was officially ever released. This album was put out under the name of Zos Kia, with the album being named Transparent. This is of course in reference to the esoteric musings of Osman Sparr, who we will get to more in just a bit. I could certainly keep discussing the very deep and personal relationship between these two amazing artists, but again, that would be an entire video on its own. For now, just understand that these early days of Psychic TV and the bond between Zoe and John Balance helped open her up to the world of transgressive music and magic even more so, and these ideas would manifest entirely into the Zero Comma project. The Beast 666 compilation was also the first appearance of Zero Comma. The track was called VVVVV, in reference to Aleister Crowley. Through this communication with Balance, Zoe would also go on to join Topi. However, she would also leave eventually, like most others, due to the issues of corruption within the group. This exodus would also be what led to John and Sleazy to go on to create Coil. Despite the falling out, these relationships, as well as the time spent in Topi, would help shape the concepts that Zoe decided she wanted to pursue in her own work. One of the big main influences from Topi was the supposed Tibetan human thigh bone flutes that were used on early Psychic TV recordings. These thigh bone flutes, which the proper name being kanglings, are used in various Tibetan Buddhist rituals and for ceremonies such as funerals. David Tibet of Current 93, an ex-Topi member, has a very interesting description of what these kanglings did and how they were to be used. He goes on to state that there's a rite where you sit in a graveyard. You're meant to sit on a corpse cross-legged and blow this thigh bone, and this summons up the demons. It's a way of bringing all your fears to the surface. You're stealing terror that they had and becoming stronger and cleansing yourself. They always had to be made from either the thigh bone of a very young virgin who had been raped or killed, or the murderer himself. The idea is that you're trying to summon out the worst parts of you. The actual instrument that you're using had to be the closest you could possibly get to evil, which is the little virgin girl, the purity destroyed, or the murderer. Zoe states a specific piece of music from Psychic TV as having one of the biggest influences on her wanting to try making music with human bones. She says that the extra 12-inch that came with the first release of the first Psychic TV album, Forced to Hand a Chance, included tracks referred to as themes, and one of these themes was called 23 Tibetan Human Thigh Bones, and utilized the aforementioned kanglings that David Tibet had previously discussed. After finally leaving Topi, and more determined than ever to discover for themselves the power of using these human bones in music, Zoe began her journey of making her own and creating one of the most mystifying albums within the genre. So now, let's finally take a moment to talk about a very important figure for the Western occult world and a person who had a major influence on many industrial artists. Now, a few fans might immediately think of Aleister Crowley, and with good reason, since he is someone who is constantly referenced within the genre and even literature surrounding these artists. Even a band name like Current 93 is in reference to Aleister Crowley. However, for how much Crowley is talked about in the sphere, another man is talked about just as much and also regarded as a massive influence for many. This man is English artist Osman Sparr. Sparr is a very unique individual, and not just in the world of artists, but also in the world of Western occultism. He is cited as a major influence for Zoe, John Balance, and the Temple of Psychic Youth, and many more. So, what makes Sparr such a fascinating individual? Well, beyond just his amazing artwork that was incredibly beautiful and detailed and far ahead of his time, he is considered by some to be the grandfather of sigil magic, and some even consider him to be the patron saint of chaos magic. Sparr had such an intimate and personal take on magic, and he was one of the best figures to show the intersection between art, magic, and psychology. His solitude and extreme individualistic approach to magic, while rejecting societal and even occult norms, makes him stand out in the esoteric world. This devotion to individualism can also be seen in many underground musicians who also led a similar life of transgressive art endeavors, but never engaging so much with the others or the outside world, as it were. Osman Sparr was born in London on December 30th, 1886, and was the fourth child of a police officer. From an early age, he was a quiet and imaginative child and very passionate about drawing, and it was immediately apparent that he was a very gifted artist. Growing up, he had attempted to enter the art world and some success with entering contests, and there was in fact no doubt to these critics that he was incredibly talented. However, the subjects of his art were very baffling to the public and seemed so far unhinged and esoteric to be part of the so-called modern art scene. They wanted Sparr to paint things they deemed worthy of painting and only in the way they seemed fit. Of course, Sparr was having absolutely none of this and pulled out of the public eye and became a private painter, continuing his work doing what he wanted to paint and only sometimes selling his artwork in bars and pubs. This would be very close to what his relationship with the occult world was also like as well. Sparr had a deep interest with theosophy and Helena Blavatsky, and he was also engaged with the newfound interest at the time of psychology writing, such as Freud and Jung. He would go on to write his own books, such as Earth Inferno in 1904, and then his highly influential work in magic in 1913, The Book of Pleasure. It should also be said that Sparr had come into contact with Aleister Crowley at some point, and the two were on friendly terms at first, with Sparr even contributing to some artwork for Crowley's zine, Equinox. Funny enough, Sparr joined Crowley's magic organization, AA, in July, and he was the 7th member, and this was the year 1907, so this adds up to 777, which is a very powerful number in the occult world, and just shows what an interesting character Sparr truly was. This relationship did not last long, however, as Sparr was very critical of Crowley's ego and need for hierarchy within his groups, and Crowley tried to claim that Sparr practiced some kind of black magic. Regardless of what happened, this again proved that Sparr liked to be on his own and do his own individual vision, whether in art or magic. It would take way too long to explain Sparr's approach to magic, and in particular, all the details of his signature sigil magic and sexual magic, but what is relevant for us today and Zoe in 0, would be the concept of Zos and Kia. So let me try to poorly explain my understanding of these concepts through what I have read and listened to. Now, Zos is the interaction between your body and your mind, the physical form in existence, and the sexual magic that you can potentially create. It represents the individual self. Kia is a very abstract and harder to explain concept. Some explain Kia as kind of being close to the concept of Taoism, the universal element that everyone interacts with. Kia is the vortex of life depicted as the divine feminine, while Zos is the organic embodiment of sentience. Kia is absolute freedom. The goal of Sparr's magic is to overcome the barrier between Zos and Kia. Sparr explains that the ego gets in the way of making this connection. Sparr suggested that sigil magic and overcoming this barrier was best done when the ego was at its weakest. The death posture was a way to weaken the ego through means of physical exhaustion. The temporary bliss of an orgasm can also weaken the ego's defenses as well. The death posture is a concept that comes across in Zoe's art quite often, including a track named on The Secret Eye of Lila. The death posture is a reference to the preferred position of meditation of Sparr to reach the best form of enlightenment. In the simplest terms, the death posture is a position of meditation where you put immense strain on your own body, usually by standing on your tiptoes, propping your body up straight, arms behind back, back arched, and lying like that until your body almost collapses and your ego has been completely exhausted. Once the ego has been weakened, we can reconnect our Zos to the Kia and have the power to make our subconscious desires happen. Sadly, this incredible soul and talent, Osman Sparr, would become sickly and poor in his later life and passed away in 1956 at the age of 69. Despite only having a few close friends and being relatively unknown to the outside world in his lifetime, Sparr's work on art and magic is still discussed, practiced, and loved to this day. It is easy to see how Zero Comma has been formed out of the influence of this legacy. Also, if you have any more interest in Sparr and his work, there's a really great Brainwashed article I will link below, as well as a podcast that goes far into more depth for Sparr and his magic. I just wanted to give this extremely basic outline of Sparr, because a lot of his qualities can be seen in Zoe's own work and with Zero Comma as well. They both have led lives as somewhat hermits, causing them and their work to become very mystifying and enigmatic. Sparr's work had a concept of neither, where something could not be perceived as one thing, nor could it be perceived as something else. This approach was also how he views sexual magic and energy. We could see in Zoe's own work that she too crossed gender boundaries and holds an idea of neither within her own body performance art. They both brought in powerful magic and spiritual aspects into their art, and both were very interested in psychology and human issues. Also interesting enough is that when Zoe joined the Temple of Psychic Youth, she was given the title of Eden 77. So, she also was given a powerful number by chance when joining a magical group, much like Sparr did. So now, with all this extra information, I hope this helps to understand why Zoe decided to make such a radical album. So now, further ado, let's finally dive into the album itself, the dark ambient masterpiece, The Secret Eye of Lila. So what does the title, The Secret Eye of Lila, even mean? This is actually a pretty interesting and thought-out concept on the part of Zoe, and I think I will just quote her from an interview with M. Sperlhofer for the album's 2014 reissue. When asked the question about the naming process for the album, she states, "The number 77 was reflected in every part of the whole concept. For example, the triangular sigil, which later has become the Zero Comma logo, was constructed from the pictograms of a sword and an eye, which is the meaning of the Hebrew letters Ayin, O, and Zain, Z. These two letters correspond with the tarot trumps, lovers, and the devil, so that one could say that unrestrained sexual force, the devil, is the secret mystery behind the dark realms of night and death, Lila, referring to the basic duality of existence. This is the true meaning of the title, The Secret Eye of Lila." The two sides of both the cassette and the vinyl version were also called O and Z. Some titles of the recording, like Love Away Yidif and Love Away Hardinif, a citation from Crowley's Book of Lies, add up to the word Lila and so on. Even the time I planned for the recording was based on numerological considerations, which gave me quite a narrow time frame to finish the project. From the psychoanalytics point of view, this could be regarded as quite neurotic, yet in occultism, you have a different view on that topic. As we can see, this album was a very calculated project for Zoe and very important to her. And of course, she was going to take it a step even further and finally bring her interests into reality. This interest, of course, being the human bone instruments that were showcased in earlier Psychic TV's work. So Zoe set out to procure some human remains to transform into instruments. Zoe had first gathered some human bones from the catacombs below St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. However, since these remains were from 100-year-old plague victims, they were too destroyed to be of any use. That's when a friend of Zoe's let her know about a charnel house. A charnel house is a vault that is typically made for depositing bones that might have been dug up during grave digging due to issues like bone migration. They can also be places where bodies were stored in times where digging a grave may not have been available to the time due to hard soil or other conditions. Either way, this specific charnel house was that Zoe was informed by a friend and had quite a bit of remains available to her pick up and bring back to her apartment. She even comments on how lucky she was at not being caught by the police while carrying a large travel bag full of human bones. In all, Zoe had grabbed from the charnel house 9 skulls, a number of small finer bones, toe bones, as well as arm and thigh bones. She discusses that once she had these bones in her apartment and begun to work on them, she had crossed societal and spiritual thresholds. She discusses some of her thoughts in the same interview with Sparr by stating the following. Some of the skulls still had hair on the top, which looked like moss, and there was a quite ghostly atmosphere in the room, which to me gave me the strong impression that these bones were not simply a material without any life in it, but that there were still rags of consciousness connected to the bones, which I had set free by my disrespectful intervention. She goes on to state that, in fact, I realized that I really had crossed fundamental borders both in general human and personal psychic regard, and that there was no way back at all. When Zoe was asked how did they get along with these feelings, Zoe had some very intriguing insight into her ideas of the metaphysical by stating, the whole experience resembled a tantric shamanic ritual in which one is confronted with death as the ultimate abyss of life's duality. In fact, you cannot pass through the underworlds without experiencing its terror. Yet the process became more and more transformative when I started to furnish the instruments and finally realized that they really worked and could be used to make music. In this regard, the whole work has not only a certain relation with the tantric tradition, but also with the Orphic mysteries. Zoe would go on to make some wind instruments, such as thigh bone flutes, and instruments that were cobbled bones with an oboe mouthpiece and a xylophone made out of 10 to 12 thigh bones. She goes into depth on the process by stating that, by sawing off the hip joints and drilling the knee joints of thigh bones, I made trumpets following the Tibetan example. From skulls, the caps were sewn off, and by covering them with sheepskin, I got my first skull drums. From a shank bone, I made a flute, and by adding the mouthpiece of an oboe to the thigh bone, combined with an L, I made further wind instruments. By filling the leftover skull caps with finger bones, I got rattles, and a bone with scores served as a kind of gyro. Finally, by fixing a row of thigh bones of different length on a wooden box, I created a simple xylophone. Zero Comma would go on tour a few times. However, since she obviously could not bring the bone instruments with her, she had to ask for help from fellow underground musicians. They would use traditional instruments such as drums, and Zoe would perform some BDSM-style performance art on stage, sometimes involving animal blood. These performances were heavily inspired by the Viennese Actionists, a modern art group keeping the spirit of the theater of cruelty alive. Zoe had been involved with them just 2 months after recording The Secret Eye of Lila. Now let's discuss the album just a little bit. I won't go over the entire album, but let me mention a few highlights so I can entice you, the viewer, to engage with this album experience for yourself. The album opens up with the track in Death Posture, a meditative and hypnotic hymn that indicates very strongly of what is to come within this album. There are no sounds of the human bones quite yet, but this track is welcoming and enticing, and it pulls you in despite just being a very minimal groan that lingers in a deep chant. The track has a meditative quality, but listening closely to the sound of the voice, one could interpret the sound as a groan, perhaps the internal sound of the strained pain while performing the death posture. Despite the death posture being incredibly physically taxing, this track is actually quite soothing. Another track, the Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, is probably one of my personal faves. This is the track to come the closest to capturing the sound of dark ambient that many have come to expect within the genre. There are even some elements of drone within this track, and a lack of any of the rhythmic drums that have been so prominent within the album so far. Yet the track still feels very strong and mystical, and rather than feeling eerie, it feels like you are being filled with some kind of rare magic. You are witnessing the results of all the rituals happening within your mind, and the music and these feelings fill you up completely. This track uses the combined bone instruments that contains the oboe mouthpiece, lending the track its drony sound. The track Hassan I Sava builds off the previous song by adding more instruments to join the flutes. It gives us a very fun and playful vibe, with all the instruments playing together. Like a group of people with distinct skills and instruments coming together randomly have a night of gathering around and playing music. It is interesting to note that the name Hassan I Saba is the name of the old man in the mountains in the writings of Marco Polo. He was the founder of the Order of Assassins, a group of, and please excuse my pronunciation, Nizari Islamism assassins that occupied the mountains of Persia and Syria, with their headquarters being Alamut Castle in modern-day Iran. Track 8 is Starlight Mire and features the bone maracas rattling. Starlight Mire is a really appropriate name because it does indeed feel like you are riding down a boat into a murky, dark, swamp-like place, and yet the music has a serene quality as well, as you can imagine a beautiful sky above you full of stars as you traverse the dark water. The interesting sound of the rattling and xylophone give off a sense of twilight and mysticism. So even though these are just a few selective highlights, I do hope you will check out this album for yourself. And with all that explanation, I think we are finally coming to the end of discussing The Secret Eye of Lila. I do find it interesting that many people seem to approach this album with some kind of mindset that it is a super evil, mysterious, ritualistic affliction upon the music world. That, as if by listening to this you're engaging in something so wicked and evil and are participating in a ritual of black magic. This is just simply not the case. In reality, what you are listening to is a woman's piece of art of her exploring the transcendental beauty between life and death, her trying to understand her own body caught between two sexual energies, while trying to engage in ideas of life and death and bring them closer, almost in a way that one would try to bring the Zos to the Kia. Her own words say it best when she states that, "In this respect, the recording was for me also a kind of alchemical act in which the cruelty of death was transformed into an immaterial manifestation of beauty in the form of music." So this, it's not evil. It's the music of a woman trying to deal with the concepts of death pushed away by society and transforming them into something more understandable, approachable, and something for everyone to see it for its beauty rather than fearing its truths. I hope that in watching this video that I have attempted to cobble together for you all this information, and you will come to understand that what helped pave the way for such an album to be created and to demystify the album itself. I want to set the record straight on the true form of this album, made with human bones, and show that it is in fact a thing of beauty and not evil. I hope, like her, you can come to understand the transformation of death to beauty and myth, an important milestone in industrial music and ritual ambient, a musical expression of Zos Kia. Thank you everyone for watching. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody's patience with me. It just takes a long time to do all this stuff. Even with this scraggly all over the place script, this actually took me quite a long time to research and read. So I always appreciate it. Engage with me in the comments, talk about your experience with this album. I'm really curious about what it was like being like when this album came out. Like, nobody quite knew exactly what was happening or who made it. Some did, but they kept it a secret. So I'm curious about like what it was like not knowing much about who this artist was in the album. But anyway, I'm glad you guys are sticking around. I kind of had a major shift in my life between work and school, so expect more videos, more quickly, hopefully. But again, see you guys next time. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.